Despite being a relatively low-key headline, I think the news that has just dropped is far more significant than it appears and actually has more sides than Nintendo are focusing on, even in their own statement. The renaming of Kirby Merchandising and Multimedia Corporation Warpstar to Nintendo Star is part of a bigger picture, a move with decades of history and which could lead to huge consequences for the future of Nintendo's corporate strategy and potentially for Kirby developers HAL Laboratory themselves. But before we get into the weeds with all this, let's start by zoning in on the announcement itself, where I feel like Nintendo kind of buried the lead of what is the most significant part. To whom it may concern, begins the announcement. Then there follows a gloriously opaque title, Strengthening Ancillary Use of Films Featuring Nintendo Intellectual Property. All this amounts to is that Nintendo's wholly owned subsidiary Warpstar Inc. is now to be renamed Nintendo Stars. They add, the company has been restructured as a Nintendo subsidiary responsible for the ancillary use business tied to films that feature Nintendo intellectual property IP. By implementing and licensing various ancillary uses in films, Nintendo Stars Inc. aims to familiarize people around the world with Nintendo IP and provide new ways to experience it. In addition, Nintendo Stars Inc. will continue its ancillary use business of the Kirby franchise, which Warpstar Inc. has been engaged in. By utilizing the know-how cultivated in this business, Nintendo Stars Inc. aims to expand the number of people who have access to Nintendo IP through cooperation with partners around the world and strengthen the relationship between Nintendo and its customers. Then there's a logo which follows the excessively simple logo styles of 1UP, Nintendo Cube, Nintendo Pictures, and other recent Nintendo logos, although it does at least have the decency to include a little star in the middle. Now, on one level, this is quite an understandable move. Warpstar has been doing a bang-up job, from what I can tell, handling merchandising for the profitable Kirby franchise on behalf of both Nintendo and HAL Laboratory, and it makes perfect sense for Nintendo to decide that they want the same skill set applied to Mario, Zelda, and perhaps other projects in the future. Although Warpstar was initially set up as a way to split the management of the Kirby IP with Kirby co-creators HAL Laboratory, and the company was owned 50-50, Nintendo stopped acknowledging Warpstar directly in its annual reports as of May 2024, opting instead just to list it under unnamed other companies in which they have an equity stake. It strikes me as likely, therefore, that since at least 2023, this long-term plan has been in effect, although, as we'll see, I think some groundwork was laid for this from the very beginning. By talking in their news announcement about movies and the name change, Nintendo have kind of distracted themselves from the actual buyout itself. I may be wrong, I may have missed it, but I don't see past references to this buyout in public, which means that behind the scenes, a lot has been going on since April, and I think a lot of this is very significant. And this is not the first move of its kind in recent months. ND Cube became Nintendo Cube and wholly owned, and Monolith Soft became a wholly owned subsidiary recently as well. We've seen this happening for years. For example, in 2017, Nintendo obtained JustNet, which then became Nintendo Sales Company Limited. At this point, they haven't made any name changes to either of their other sales subsidiaries, IQ in China, or their several development subsidiaries, Retro Studios, Next Level Games, 1UP Studio, SRD, Mario Club, Monolith Software, and Shiver Entertainment. However, it's completely possible that they may choose to do this in future. However, beyond the branding, what are the consequences of all this? Well, for one thing, a huge injection of cash into HAL Laboratory. This injection of funds could be very welcome if, for example, they wanted to dramatically ramp up development on a major 3D Kirby to take the franchise beyond even the scope of Forgotten Land, although I rather suspect that if their target date is the anniversary in April 2027, then by now the game is already heavily underway. But while there are plus sides for HAL, there are downsides too. Specifically, while Nintendo was always and evidently the senior partner in the relationship, they did have some level of control over how they monetize Kirby through their joint ownership of Warpstar Inc. HAL still co-owns Kirby and so will still be consulted, but pragmatically, they are dependent on Nintendo in most respects in terms of how to monetize their character. Nintendo own the property and they publish the games, and now they are also responsible for any movies and merchandising through Nintendo Stars. This raises the question, is it plausible that we could see a next level games type situation where HAL is bought out entirely by Nintendo? I've discussed this before with respect to Intelligent Systems. Intelligent Systems was created by an ex-Nintendo employee, is a gentle stroll from Nintendo's Kyoto HQ, and has been a collaborator on massive franchises like Paper Mario, Fire Emblem, WarioWare, and Advance Wars. Why aren't Nintendo purchasing them when it would make so much sense from a consolidatory point of view? Well, they don't need to. The company is strongly incentivized to keep supporting Nintendo anyway, but they maintain operational independence and their own management structure. Plus, until very recently, it's not like Nintendo had the spare cash to splash given their struggles during the Wii U era. However, if Nintendo do aspire to do something with Kirby that they've done with Mario and Zelda and launch a true multimedia franchise, more than just the anime series for whose production Warpstar Inc. was originally convened, but a much grander Kirby multimedia universe, it may suit Nintendo to have a bigger say in HAL Laboratory. Now, having said that, HAL has managed to remain Nintendo aligned through quite a few transitions. On its board are the president, 2 directors, and an auditor as of 2024. The directors are both Kirby programmers, specifically Shinya Kumazaki, who is in his late 40s, and Nobuto Kuroki, who joined the company circa 2006, suggesting that he may be in his late 40s as well. The president, Shigefumi Kawase, has worked with Nintendo since offering technical support on the Nintendo 64 and appears to be possibly in his 50s, as far as I can tell. The previous long-term president, Satoshi Mizuhara, who formally left in 2020 after easing out for some years prior, and Masayoshi Tanimura, who in 2018 was appointed chairman of the board, are no longer referenced as directors, but it may still be that they are shareholders in the company all the same. HAL's own corporate timeline on their website doesn't reflect Mitsuhara's departure, but his name was removed as chairman of the board from the list of directors as of the 2020 website update. This suggests that HAL is happily puttering along as an independent entity under new management, having completed a successful transition from the old guard. No reference in here to Nintendo at all. Even if the former heads of HAL aren't actively involved in the company, though, this doesn't necessarily mean that they don't maintain a financial interest. They would also be at an age where they are going to need to take a view of what to do with their shares of the company. Perhaps they've already sold them, but it's quite possible that they haven't. The thing is, even 6 or 7 years ago, Nintendo might have struggled to buy up these shares without sacrificing other, more immediate ambitions, but this is no longer the case, and as we saw with Monolith Soft and Next Level Games, when it comes to these long-term business relationships, as the senior people begin to leave, this is where Nintendo tends to make their move. Indeed, with all these recent dealings, it seems that Nintendo is following a fairly consistent playbook, none of which would be feasible without the huge success of the Switch, partly aided by the benign exchange rate conditions over recent years, which have meant that this decade has seen multiple years that are Nintendo's most profitable on record. The logical thing to do is to fix the roof while the sun is shining, and this includes mending some of Nintendo's long-term strategic vulnerabilities. So we saw that Monolith Soft was hugely valuable to them, and while a 4% outstanding share owned by the original founders was originally a way to keep these key developers invested and rewarded for their efforts, in the long term, and as the heads of Monolith Soft age out, it's far cleaner for Nintendo to be able to act unilaterally and to own this vital subsidiary outright. This isn't a case of Nintendo doing badly by the Monolith Soft top brass at all. When they were facing having to cut significant parts out of the planned content for the original Xenoblade Chronicles, the team was astonished that Nintendo producers ensured that they were afforded extra time, a courtesy apparently unimaginable at Namco. We saw respect at the heart of their dealings with Next Level Games, where it was the decision of Next Level Games' senior people to step back that triggered Nintendo to decide to intercede and protect a valuable development asset by purchasing the company outright. Note, though, that for a decade prior, Next Level Games had become a Nintendo exclusive developer, so it seems that this plan was long in the making. Even if some HAL shareholders were minded to be sympathetic to Nintendo, though, why might they sell? There are a number of general reasons, not least of which is turning an illiquid asset such as their HAL holdings into actual money that can be spent in retirement. Also, Japan has, by international standards, an extremely tough inheritance tax regime. While passing shares may be a beneficial way of minimizing tax payable, this is not without risks. One is that simply to pay off the tax, the inheritors may need to cash in the shares anyway at a time that might not be especially propitious to them, simply to pay the inheritance tax bill. Still, cashing in HAL shares doesn't empty the options box for other investment possibilities, so unless for sentimental value, the longest standing shareholders of the company may feel inclined to sell and put their money into something a little bit more diversified. However, the biggest motivating force may be a very long-term arrangement indeed. Nintendo has actually had a significant stake in HAL Laboratory previously. As I understand it, Nintendo needs to declare any significant stakes in companies like Monolith Soft and so on. In their 2025 annual report, they confirmed that they have a 32% stake in the Pokemon Company still, and a further 3 companies they own stakes in, presumably one being Warpstar as was, then another being Pux, who they purchased a 28% stake in during 2013 for technology they applied towards Wii U fitness games. The third company, I'm fairly certain from recent financial reports, is First Avenue Entertainment, a Minneapolis-based group who bought Nintendo's stake in the Seattle Mariners, and in exchange, Nintendo bought a 10% stake, reportedly, in the First Avenue Entertainment group. At any rate, none of these are HAL. However, if we go back far enough, we can say for absolute certain that Nintendo did have a stake in HAL. In a 2001 document listed under affiliates with equity method applied are a number of companies, but included among them is HAL Laboratory. Now, what this means is that in 2001 it is probable that Nintendo owned anywhere between 10% and 50% of HAL Laboratory, and while they may have divested themselves of a good deal of that stock since, HAL doesn't appear in Nintendo's financial documents from 2002 onwards after all, it's unlikely that they completely cut ties. Now, 2001 is very significant, of course, because what was founded in 2001? Why, Warpstar Incorporated. It seems perfectly plausible that the Nintendo investment was diverted in whole or in part into Warpstar as the receptacle for the Kirby-related IP management, therefore ending Nintendo's direct ownership towards HAL, or at least making it so minimal that it's below the threshold to be reported on during these financial briefings. What that threshold is remains unclear. Their first entertainment ownership seems to be just 10%, but I've also seen it stated that 20% to 50% stakes would generally attract reporting. At any rate, this gives the long-term background to the financial footing upon which Warpstar appeared to stand. Effectively, Nintendo is now extending its reach from the more modest arrangements from 2001 into a much more substantial ownership position, although at this point HAL itself remains unaffected. If it's the case, as it seems to be though, that Nintendo once held a significant quantity of shares in HAL, they could well have sold those shares on a right of first refusal basis, meaning that if and when those shares were sold, Nintendo would be able to reacquire them should they wish. I imagine under the current circumstances, Nintendo would most certainly wish, and depending on the wording of the contract, it may be that the shares would not be even eligible to be passed on to children at all, but would need to be sold on the death of the shareholder. Now look, Nintendo might not have insisted on clauses like these, even if they were put into place at all, but given that the company was run by Hiroshi Yamauchi, a hard-nosed Japanese businessman if ever there was one, I think an arrangement like this seems likely, and it would also explain the way that the Monolith Soft acquisition was finally completed in 2024. If there isn't this kind of preferential arrangement in Nintendo's favour built in, HAL could have other options therefore. They could use the infusion of cash from selling Warpstar to buy out the legacy shareholders themselves, and we don't know for sure that these founders of the company haven't sold their stock previously, of course. The thing is though, Nintendo currently has, and for a long time has maintained, a functional working relationship with HAL, but if they do have any vision that in the next 10 to 20 years The management at HAL might take a more oppositional stance, and that Nintendo therefore might want to own HAL outright, which would include, of course, owning outright the highly lucrative Kirby brand. Nintendo may never have a better opportunity. Like Nintendo themselves, HAL Laboratory is growing rapidly. It counted 169 employees in 2019, 202 in 2022, and 242 in 2024. Now, part of this is necessary to offset a few hits, notably the closure of regular support studio Vanpool in May 2023. It also reflects an industry-wide trend in the early 2020s, but because of the huge success of Kirby and the Forgotten Land and the likely continued success of the Kirby franchise, HAL may be better able to continue its growth trajectory. If Kirby does become subject to a major motion picture deal as a result significantly of Nintendo's management of the company, HAL would become all the dearer to buy, and largely off the back of Nintendo's own efforts, ironically. In this case, Nintendo may view it as preferable not simply to reacquire the portion they once owned, but also to buy the company outright. But the HAL of 2001 is a completely different beast from the company as it stands today. See if you can spot the difference in their output. In 1999, 2000 and 2001, the few years before Warpstar was founded, they released Super Smash Bros., Pokemon Snap, Pokemon Pinball, SimCity 64, Kirby 64, Metal Slader Glory, and Super Smash Bros. Melee, as well as a game called Shigesato Itoi's Bass Fishing. In 2020 to 2025, HAL released Kirby Fighters 2, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Kirby's Dream Buffet, Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, and now Kirby and the Forgotten Land Nintendo Switch 2 Edition plus Starcross World. While HAL experimented briefly in the late 2010s with their own independent mobile ventures under the name HAL Egg, it seems that this decade they have really doubled down on Kirby exclusively, and this means that their Warpstar is aligned with Nintendo far more heavily than ever before. This makes some sense when you consider the Box Boy and Part-Time UFO, while not without their fans, are probably a tiny part of their balance sheet, and that game development is a far more complex business these days, which means that HAL can't offer their services out quite so freely. This means that the value of HAL is completely intertwined with Nintendo, and now Nintendo not only control the Kirby property, which is pretty much all that HAL are working on, but also control its merchandising and multimedia content. We can see a counterexample of how a different company allied with Nintendo has chosen to try to retain a much greater degree of operational independence. Game Freak has used recent years to progressively decouple from Nintendo, launching in 2026 its own AAA new IP on non-Nintendo hardware. Clearly, the absolutely vast Pokemon franchise remains what keeps the light on over at Game Freak HQ, but Game Freak themselves have shown no sign of giving ground to Nintendo, and the Pokemon company clearly retains its own distinctive operational character in many ways, even though Nintendo owns 32% outright and in actuality has a far bigger stake than that, although this is a topic I plan to return to in a separate video quite soon now. The key thing here, though, is that while Game Freak are trying to retain independence, HAL now has a choice. Start to build other franchises which they can directly control, or else lean into Kirby and slipstream Nintendo. Almost certainly Kirby is where the money is. And if this is the case, it would make a lot of sense to ultimately be bought out by Nintendo. Now, this wouldn't be a hostile takeover. That's not Nintendo's way, and it would be utterly counterproductive to a long, healthy, and harmonious business relationship. They're not as interested in these companies for assets like the chairs and computers, although the Kirby IP does have a massive bearing on things, but they want to bring the people along as well because they understand how vital those relationships are. But I think this could be a very good business deal. Everyone involved at HAL in senior positions stands to become exceedingly wealthy, and Nintendo would doubtless maintain the company's operational independence for a significant time, certainly if their treatment of Monolith Soft is any precedent. It may well be that they would have similar shareholdings until retirement, meaning that for a couple of decades or more, HAL would not be entirely under Nintendo's ownership, even though it would be, for all intents and purposes, under its control. And in many respects, surrendering their stake in Warpstar might be a first good step for HAL to make this move. It certainly doesn't feel like the move of a company that's looking to significantly branch away, as it means they are surrendering a huge amount of their independence. Even if this is a long-term plan, though, nothing is terribly urgent. While it seems reasonably likely that Nintendo will make moves to own a greater stake in HAL over time, I would guess that it's 30% likely that we will see reports of Nintendo acquiring equity, or a greater equity, in HAL Laboratory before the end of 2027, though not necessarily buying the company outright. We could easily see a similar kind of situation to Monolith Soft, where the company ends up with a 96% ownership, which it progressively increases over the decades. Incidentally, I could also see similar buyouts of, for example, their Nintendo system partners DNA, since Nintendo frequently likes to start with a joint venture and then take over in full themselves once their capacity is built up. Nintendo prioritizes these stable relationships, but if the opportunity arises, I do feel they will advance. So, let's come back to Nintendo Star. Yes, it means that Nintendo has a merchandising outfit capable of doing for Mario and Zelda what Warpstar has done for Kirby, which has to be a good thing given Kirby's huge merch dominance in Japan, the fact that it had a successful anime, and the fact that hopefully other Nintendo stars will emerge from this company. Yes, this also means a short-term win for HAL in terms of capital, and I am intrigued to see if that will become apparent in future Kirby titles. But it also means the loss of a significant chunk of control for HAL, and potentially a massive fork in the road for them. Where in 2001, HAL was a diversified group signing an equal ownership deal for distribution of Kirby, they are now a company basically focused on the Kirby franchise and effectively subject to Nintendo's direction, and I'm just not sure how sustainable that is unless it ends with them sooner or later merging into Nintendo as and when the senior people decide to move on. Now, of course, HAL isn't the only company not owned by Nintendo but who have very significant business interests tied up. One such company is Intelligent Systems, and I've got another video from a while back detailing that relationship. If you enjoyed this video, please do like and share. There's also a link to the Patreon below, but otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.